Hello again, Philip. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. What drew you to the neurology space?
Yeah, so I started in medical school. We were given the option to do a rotation, uh, probably during the second year.
Mhm.
And during that second year, I took some time to do an away rotation in neurology here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and it gave me that experience seeing firsthand neurology and using the physical exam
Hmm.
to gather the differential. Um, and then using different things to support that thought of what you think someone has. And there's not a whole lot in medicine that relies more on the physical exam than neurology does. And I feel like that's a great way to get a personal connection. And that's
Hmm.
what drove me mostly to neurology.
Building that personal connection with people. Could you just talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so I think you listen to their story, and then there's an interesting aspect where you can see the physical manifestations of disease in neurology that adds a lot to their story. And in some cases, the complaint is vague, like weakness or headache or something where they're telling you, and until you touch the person or look at their reflexes or see how strong they're.
When you're being with those patients and when you're trying to have a genuine patient connection, what have you seen be the most impactful in order to do that?
I think that's time.
Ah.
Time is the biggest factor for forming that relationship. There's different healthcare scenarios where you're given more time. Um, I feel like a lot of, primary care doesn't get a lot of time to see their patients, whereas some
Mhm.
subspecialists get more protected time. So we get like an hour to see a new patient, half hour for follow-ups. And that's a lot different than what some specialties get, which is 15 minutes, 20
Yeah.
minutes.
Especially with, I mean, I can imagine with the influx of patients that you would be seeing too. Like, how are you able to give them all that equal amount of time and attention, with all the different things coming at you?
Yeah. Without having that time in neurology, there's no real way to get a good story from listening to the patient as well as doing that physical exam. And oftentimes, it takes communicating back to the patient what your findings and suspicions are to gain a little trust and form a relationship. And that common denominator is time. If you don't have time, it makes it really hard.
I can see. What has been a patient experience that you still think of, that you still go back to as you're practicing? Hmm.
I was working in the neurointensive care unit, and we had a patient that had come in with stroke-like symptoms. So they were weak, they couldn't talk, they were having problems breathing, but they were still awake. Uh, and by the time they got to us, we did emergent imaging and found that they had multiple areas where they had blood in their brain as well as their brain stem. And then this patient had a history of renal cancer,
Hmm.
and that
Hmm.
renal cancer metastasized. And, it was a conversation with the patient who was cognizant enough to know what's going on, able to understand the questions, but not able to express themselves. And
Hmm.
they continued to have breathing issues, swallowing problems because of where their brainstem was injured. And there were conversations with family about intubating and sedating and seeing the outcome. Um, but having, again, that time to talk to the patient and the family. What was going on was emergent, yes, but um, the patient was stable enough where you have that gift of time to say, hey, bad things are happening in the brain. The
Yeah.
outcome isn't likely to be good. We could intubate you, but it's unlikely that you'd come off of this breathing tube. What are your goals? Because I'm sure, the
Yeah.
diagnosis of cancer is new. This understanding that it's metastasized is new. And then now those areas are bleeding in your brain. Let's make a life decision right now, which is really
Yeah.
hard. But I think having the time to talk through with the patient and with the family and everyone's on the same page offered a good transition for that patient at the end of the day. Which, those last few hours are pretty emotionally charged. But
Yeah.
I think because everyone had the same understanding of what was going to happen, we saved suffering in the patient and then suffering in the family. Because again, with that time, everyone had the same understanding of what was going to happen and what was going on.
Thank you
So
for
I
sharing.
think that
Yeah.
was an impactful situation where, you know, the end result wasn't ideal.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that because that's so unfortunately real and not
Mm-hmm.
common, but it happens. And so I'm also just really struck with is for you moving from patient to patient and seeing, I'm not saying that this is a common occurrence, but you see this more often than your regular person. How do you exercise empathy?
Yeah. So there's an interesting book called Compassion. So it's like kind of banking and then understanding where you're going to spend some of that empathic energy. Yeah, there's a lot of little things that can take your empathy. And I think it takes different situations to understand, where can I appropriate this so that at the end of the day, I've helped someone without going home and feeling like I have nothing left to give. I think
Yeah.
that's common in healthcare is that,
Yeah.
we give so much of ourselves in that interaction that it's hard to go home and give it to people that, love us and we love them, but it's a hard way to continue to give that emotional energy. So, and that I think comes with experience. And I think it's a little maybe more natural because you can read a book about it all you want,
Mm.
but it comes down to understanding what your limits are because everyone's different. Even doctors are different. People are going to have different tolerance levels about.
Mm. And so when you're shifting, like as you were saying, when you're shifting from work to home and back to work, how are you able to, as you're saying, like preserve that empathy for your family, for the people that you love, and also in the same sense, not bank it for patients, but like ensure that you are still full enough to give and receive?
There are some people who are really good about separating. So,
Mm.
change in environment. You change from the hospital to home. That's an entirely different situation. You don't even think about work when you go home. I think that's a lot easier to a degree, for inpatient and shift
Yes.
type work because, you know, a lot of times when you're not bringing your work home, you can get it done in the hospital. If you're in the clinic, sometimes, you're doing work from home or you have the ability to take work home with you to finish.
Mm.
Um, and that makes that separation a little bit harder. And from the inpatient perspective, you meet these people. Sometimes, now the traditional way of how medicine goes, you don't follow these people outside the clinic. There's no more like traditional neurologists where you do a clinic and then you also round on people in the hospital. You stay in the clinic and then there's another person who's rounding in the hospital that's the same part of your team,
Okay.
unless you're in a very small community hospital. But my understanding is that that is far and few between now. But when you establish a relationship with people, you're following them up sometimes for years down the road, and you're dealing with things that come up with their life along with their disease. So it's hard, I think, from that perspective, to leave that stuff behind and never think about it, because
Yeah.
how often does work affect someone who's not in medicine? Who's
Yeah.
you're interacting with people just to a different degree. Um, and for me, I think in the first part of my training, I was having a really hard time separating that, having a cut and dry, like, this is work, this is home. And with my now wife, that separation was hard because if I had a bad day at work, it oftentimes led to a bad day. If I had
Mm.
bad conversations, like the one I just gave you as an example,
Yeah.
it was hard to engage at home and be feel like, yeah, in retrospect, you can always go back and think about that and think, oh, I did help people, but in the moment, it's still raw and you're just going through life thinking, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
um so you know, um, but again, I think that comes with experience, and I think you have to have a good mentor in
Mm.
medicine to help guide you through that. I don't think, if you're going to try and figure it out by yourself, I think you're going to have a really hard time.
Kind of not, yeah, I mean, I feel like this week has been, I personally have heard the saying a lot, like if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together,
Yeah.
and so having a mentor, as you're saying, in a team. I actually have a question about that. When you're going through talking with the patients and ensuring that your empathy is intact, how often do you feel you rely on other partners within your care team to have that patient interaction?
Um, so we have an epilepsy monitoring unit, and that's
Mm.
part of our role where we're in the hospital interacting with patients. And we have great support there with nurse practitioners and residents and fellows. And sometimes, as part of that supervising role, we're able to kind of provide our understanding of what's going on, and the nurse practitioner, the resident, the fellow can relay that to the patient, and
Hmm.
we're there as a reinforcing agent. So that at times, gives them a chance to give difficult news and educate patients on that
Mm.
news, where you can stand back and watch them have that interaction more than being actively engaged in it. So I think that's a different aspect of having empathy and empathizing with patients, with your learners, stuff like that. And I think that's why I'm in epilepsy, is because there's a variation in things you can do.
Mm.
I think having a variation in your patient interactions is also healthy. Um, and that's how I can kind of balance some of those where it goes. I know my clinic weeks are going to be heavy because it's just me. But those inpatient times, it's easier because sometimes you can distribute those conversations to others.
Yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. I can definitely see the just the impact of being able to shift and variation really, really helping and making an impact for you so that you can make an impact for others. So then I guess along the lines of impact and just patient access as a whole, what is a common misconception that you've heard or that you felt from your patients about access or even people at large who are trying to come into the hospital and they have questions like what are some just common issues in that sphere that you've seen and faced?
Yeah, I think if we're looking from the clinical side, like outpatient, a
Hmm.
lot of that's access issues. Um, and I don't think it's necessarily misconceptions. It's just so many different hoops, scheduling things that people have to
Yeah.
trickle down through, like Plinkos,
Yeah.
until they hit the right spot. And there's a lot of places where people can get stuck, whether that's insurance, travel. Like if
Yeah.
we're in a relatively good access area, we have public transport, but some
Hmm.
people come from outside of Grand Rapids where they don't have access to that. So that's a barrier. We're downtown, so a lot of people come from rural areas too that do have transportation,
Hmm.
but they find parking in more of this urban setting difficult.
Yeah.
And to be honest, our hospital isn't super great with getting even into the clinics, because we have an elevator from the um, parking garage, and then an elevator across the hall that goes up to the towers where the
Mhm.
offices are. And sometimes people will just be sitting in that garage elevator
Oh.
going up and down thinking that the number for P6 is where their appointment's supposed to be, but in reality, you gotta go across the hall. So I've run into probably like at least three of those people a week when I'm coming to
Oh man, yeah.
work.
Oh gosh, that you sounds like the hospital. So I'm from New York, Long Island specifically, and I remember I was trying to get my mom to a doctor's appointment at like 7 in the morning, and she was so anxious. And so
Yep.
I'm okay, trying to calm her down, and we're trying to get into the hospital, but it's a maze. Like we were trying, just finding. I mean, thankfully we had a couple of security guards helping us try to find our way, but we end up like trying to look through this hospital. Turns out they have a sister building across the street, which is where she was supposed to go. And so got to bring her all the way over there. And it's just, it was just a lot. But yeah, I like physical barriers. You'd never
Yep.
getting options, you know?
Because nobody builds a hospital the size that it needs to be at the beginning, and then everything's added on just where there's room. And,
Oh, yeah.
a lot of times that doesn't make a lot of sense, but
Well,
organization wise, but maybe geographically, sure.
yeah, right? Like, yeah, I guess the floor plans made sense like 20 years ago, but right now, just to make it.
Yeah.
Oh, man. But so, I guess getting back to just neurology as a whole, when you're talking to people about neurology or you're meeting people or hearing things online, what is a common misconception about neurology and epilepsy that you feel people have?
Yeah. I think a big misconception is that people with epilepsy are, you know, disabled or they can't do
Mm.
things or they have, um, and then I think a separate part of this is mental illness, and I think that's a big misconception too. But a lot of times epilepsy goes hand in hand with anxiety and depression. Um,
Mm. Yes.
which isn't a surprise because epilepsy is a chronic illness. And with chronic illness comes anxiety and depression. Um, but, a lot of these people, at least 50 to 55% of the population can respond to two medications for epilepsy. So those patients can go on to, still be in the workforce,
Yeah.
as long as your seizures are controlled based on your state regulations and laws. You can go back to driving. Um, these people have families, they have kids that grow up. Some patients I get who have epilepsy, we're in a center where we deal a lot with patients who are refractory to medication. So they're on 3, 4
Mm.
medications, getting surgery for their epilepsy, and they're pretty disheartened and upset with the diagnosis, understandably. But there's still room to go. It's not a
Mm.
dead end. It's like any disease. Do you have it, or do you have epilepsy, or does epilepsy have you, sort of thing? And I think that's a
Mm.
mindset that people have to think about, um, especially when they're at the beginning dealing with this. Because you see some young kids that come in and they're
Ah.
18, 19, 20, and you're talking to them about this, and they're like, well, what happens to my driving? What happens to me playing sports? What happens to me going to college? Can I still do my engineering degree? Can I still go to medical school? And the answer to all those things, yeah. It just takes time. Um, we have a lot of neurologists that have epilepsy.
Wow.
And that
Okay.
some there's one of our prior mentors here. I never got the chance to meet him, but he was I believe, and I hope I'm not messing this story up, but he was a neurology resident, and we have a annual meeting in the American Epilepsy Society, and his first seizure was within that during that
Wow.
conference. So he had a lot of people there witnessing the event.
Oh
So
my
yeah,
God.
yeah, and he had a part of his brain removed for his seizures. So he's a big advocate for understanding what deficit is going to be if you remove a part of the brain. We have a bunch of other options for that, but that's like your hands-on experience, knowing what's going to happen, how it goes, and then dealing with the effects afterwards. So his ability to communicate with epilepsy patients is phenomenal, let alone advocating for them in a group setting, as well
Hmm.
as talking to them in a personal setting too.
No, I mean, wow. Talk about, I mean, I can't even wrap my head around that, having your first seizure. I mean, in a way, it's kind of a blessing in disguise if you're going to ever have a seizure.
Yep,
You're in a
right
room,
place.
right?
Except
Oh,
we being freaked out by seizures, I think.
wow.
A lot of time I can imagine, like, if he was having this happen, they're just whipping out their notebooks and watching,
Oh
writing
my
things
God.
down. Like, what part of your brain do you think that's coming from? Well, he's like in
So
the middle of a
crazy.
seizure, yeah. But, not to say that we don't take seizures seriously, but
Of
it's
course.
just more of a comical approach that I could see going
That,
through a conference and having that, yeah.
like, really? Tell me more. Like, where? That's so interesting. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, that's very. very inspiring. And just, especially, yeah, when you're 18, 19, going to college or wanting to learn how to drive or all of these things. Can you talk a little bit more about that mindset? Especially, as you're saying, when you're meeting these refractory patients who are on 3, 4 different medications and things haven't worked. How are you able to cultivate that mindset for them or help them cultivate it?
Yeah. So I think um, those patients and sitting down and realizing that, you know, with those with those patients on multiple medications, they're still having seizures. So
Mm,
yeah, driving is off the table. Um, but there's a lot of other options to get around if you have a good family support system. Some people are fortunate to have that. Public transport's always an option. Some of these people live in a more centralized location where having a car isn't as important as it
yeah.
is in other parts of the United States.
Hmm.
So that makes it easier. It's hard to broach the concept of continuing to go to school if they have limiting seizures. I think it's
Mm,
still very possible, but then the more medications you add on people that act on the brain, like anti-seizure medications, tends to lead to more fatigue, dizziness. Some of
yes.
the medications can cause some cognitive issues.
Yes.
However, seizures that continue can also result in cognitive symptoms themselves. And what I'd say to that is there's not anyone that would tell you no if you're going into a career where you can do that safely. If we're looking at commercial airline pilot, that's a much different conversation,
Yeah.
which I have had rare conversations with patients who wanted to go to flight school or wanted to go to the Air Force, and you're having that was their life aspiration, and you're
Ah,
seeing them for the first time with seizures saying, yeah, you're not going to be behind the cockpit of any kind of commercial flight or Air Force flight. And so that's kind of crushing for them to see that, but at least then you can give them hope for a different career path, and even if
hmm.
that's engineering or something that's related to you can maybe you don't get to fly them, but maybe you can help build them.
Yeah.
And it's just a different approach, so it's kind of counseling those people to turn around negative into more of a positive, and look at it in a different way. And a lot of times, yeah, that's still hard when you're giving them the
Hmm.
first evidence and the first kind of like, yeah, it's gonna be impossible to do that.
Oh, that is tough. And I mean, there's part of me I like that empathizes obviously with the patient, building yourself up to that. And there's another part of me that empathizes with you having to tell that to them. And oh, how many other patients have you had? What is something about this career that you were surprised about when you were really a couple of years into it, that you were like, wow, I did not know this when I first decided.
The biggest thing I realize is the importance of having support for the patient as well as support for yourself. And I guess what I mean by that is that a lot of times these patients are going through a very difficult time, whether that's dealing with multiple medications or they're going into a hospital setting where we're monitoring them to move towards surgery for their epilepsy.
Mm,
And that needs, it comes down to everybody who's in the hospital: nurses, janitorial staff, technical staff, everyone who's interacting with that patient on a daily basis can add to a positive experience and a positive outcome. And it made me look back and realize that there's even little things that can make a huge difference to someone's day.
mm,
More not necessarily what I can do, but what other people are doing. And I think that comes from the culture that we cultivate here.
oh,
I don't think it's just in epilepsy, um, or neurology itself, but hopefully in healthcare that you're in the hospital to help people. Yeah, sometimes your day sucks, but you just have to say something nice to somebody once, and this is the
mm,
one time you're interacting with them. for the day, or if you're a nurse and you do 3 12s or something, and this is one of your patients for your week or your shift, so you're seeing them 3 days in a row. That they're great at getting to know people and to have that personal relationship, and that's very important for helping these people get through it. And it's also very important for us as epileptologists, nurse practitioners, PAs dealing with the illness aspect of it, to
Mm-hmm.
have a big help from the social side too. I think the more you get interested in the disease and fixate on the disease, I feel like the further away the person gets. So you can hone in on what you're seeing from the data and information side, and it's hard to pull that person back into the picture. But
Yeah.
then you have staff that helps you with that, and that, I think, support for the patient, support for you, family is of the utmost importance, I think, for these patients, because they're advocating for them, right? If
Mm-hmm.
you've got a family member in the hospital, they're more times than not communicating to the nurses more than the patient is. At least that's what my experience is. But yeah, but the reason is because they want what's best for their loved one who's in the bed, and maybe doesn't have the ability to communicate that as much as they do. And I think that goes to healthcare workers too, having a really good supportive home family, and things to look forward to when you go home.
Mm.
Like a loving partner, if you've got pets, if you have a hobby. I went into medical school and residency thinking, yep, this is all I'm going to be, this is all I'm going to
Yeah.
do. Like, um, and I'm sure there's people in the middle of it right now that are finding out that if that's all you identify as, it makes going forward and forth to work really, really difficult. If you've got something that you enjoy outside of work and can look forward to, I think that's better than not. You can be a great clinician and a great doctor without giving 110% of yourself and your energy every day to this. Sometimes it's better if you can separate yourself out and compartmentalize a little bit. you know.
Yeah. I mean, it's just because I'm just now thinking like full circle back to when we were starting about like just the empathy. Like, there's only so much of you that you can give until you don't have enough of it, and you can't pour into yourself as much. And so, especially for your patients, and like how, if that's what you want to do, like how are you best to do that job if you can't help yourself? It's ironic almost in the way that you like have to refill yourself and step away from the job in order to do the best at the job, especially at the job that you want to do. It's interesting.
When I was going from residency to fellowship now, I've been practicing at my current institution. I trained here, so I know the people, I know
Mm,
everything for 6 years. Now being out, kind of doing my own thing, I still have the support of my now peers to ask questions. Um, but I get excited to come in every day. And I hope that people in healthcare can leave feeling like they did a great job and to be excited to come back
yeah.
and see the next patient, help the next person, talk to the next family, instead of leaving feeling drained and then
Yeah.
not happy to come back. You know, I I think maybe that's easier in subspecialties than it is in primary care. Um, and I'm, reminded of that by my wife, who's a physician assistant, and she gets the 15-minute appointments, the
Yeah.
30-minute ones that turn into 7 minutes that they only have. So I feel guilty sometimes that I have so much time to see these patients. And she doesn't let me forget it.
Just gonna rub it in every now
Yeah,
and then.
yeah, yeah,
Because if you're not poking fun, I mean, like, what are you doing? Like, come on.
yeah,
You gotta.
yeah. Come on.
you so much. So I'm looking at the time and I don't want to take too much of it, but I do have one question that I always end with. If you were to go back, and you've kind of already answered this, but I'm interested to hear. If you were to go back to the beginning of your story, to the beginning of you deciding becoming a doctor, what would you have told yourself?
Yeah. So that's a really interesting question. Um, when I was young, I worked in the healthcare setting. I worked as a certified nurse's aide or a CNA,
Mm-hmm.
and then I worked as a medical assistant. So in the hospital setting, I worked in the in the ICU,
Okay.
in the cardiac telemetry unit, and infectious disease as like a clerk kind of data gathering, and then as an MA in an orthopedic office. And when I told people, I was applying to medical school and trying to get in there, they often would say, "Why?"
Oh my god.
And these are doctors and I'd give them the answer, because I want to, be invested in taking care of people. I found that fulfilling while I was working in the hospital setting, and some of them didn't buy that. They didn't like it. They were like, "Yeah, good luck," and there,
Wow.
someone else said there's so many hoops to jump through, why bother, type of thing. And some of the people I asked, they were like, I wouldn't do it again. Um, it takes a lot. If you talked to me while I was in the middle of my residency, that probably would have been my same answer too. Because I think there's a certain attitude in training to get into medicine that
Mm,
I feel like you're pretty sheltered from in those years of medical school. Everything's bright, shiny, new sort of thing. You start learning, and then those other years you get experiencing patients and stuff, still working with residents, and you're shielded by you're still in your curriculum type of thing. And then
mhm.
once you get into residency, there's a lot of mental strain that I think is put on people, and not a lot of flexibility. So you're expected to work, you're expected not to
Yeah.
complain, and you're expected to have no issues. And the people who are training you often will say, "Well, that's how it was when I was training," or the now you guys have it easy sort of thing. And
Yep.
um, I think a lot of that is what grinds down on people. And then you ask them, would you do it again? Their
Mm,
answer is going to be no, and I think that's like anyone who's in a traumatizing situation or struggling together. If you go back and ask, hey, would you want to do that again?
right.
You know, who's going to say yes?
Right.
But yeah, I hope that there's you know, I'm in my institution. I'm trying to get involved with resident and fellow education, and I think that that's the way to change that path for people. You shouldn't be afraid to go into residency, because these people are trying to teach you. They're trying to help you learn, and learning through fear isn't a good way to learn.
Yeah.
Learning through
Yeah.
comedy and laughing and understanding situations and having a connection with people, that's the way to do it. And I hope that this generation of people that are moving through residency will be able to change it and turn it around, because it takes a culture change. The last thing I want to do is perpetuate the idea that, oh, that's how I went through residency, so I'm going
Right.
to make you do it too, and then just give them the thumb, and which I don't, because if someone's bringing a concern to you as a colleague or a trainee, you have to listen to that concern just like you do with your patients.
Yeah.
And I think a part of that again is time. We don't give time to our learners. There's so many things that are pulling away at teachers in the setting, because they're still doctors, they're still doing
Mm,
their job, and there's a lot of responsibilities pulling their attention. So I don't have a lot to foster on learners. And then just like, if you're on the phone and your kids trying to pester you or something, you shove them
Right.
away. It's like that, you don't give them a lot of time. You just give them the
Mm.
business and give them to go away. and um, and I think that has more of a profound impact than people used to realize, especially if you're just trying to learn. And then
Mm.
when I went into fellowship, that experience was a lot different, because the first year I was able to, check the boxes. You're offered a lot of things in your institution for a learning perspective and people who are willing to teach and sit down and talk to you. And then the second year, I had the flexibility to make it what I wanted. So I was
Mm.
able to get deeper into things that I found interesting in ways that I could help kind of foster how I want to take care of patients,
Yeah.
and learn from those people. So I think I remember a graphic that was drawn in a rotation I had with some neurosurgery people, and they had a drawing in their resident room that was a big hill, and there was excrement coming down this hill, and there was an attending, so someone who's done with their training is working. They're on the top of this hill, and they're just kind of shoveling this
Ah.
excrement. And as it rolls down the hill,
Ooh.
you have a senior resident, so someone who's towards the end of their training, a
Yep.
junior, so in the middle, and then there's a trough. And in the trough is the person first
Ooh.
starting. So
Ooh.
there's a mountain of things coming towards them. But then on the hill, there's like over the other side of the trough on the hill is the medical student.
Oh
you know,
my
because they're
God.
protected by the institution stuff and all that. And I feel like
Oh
that's kind of realistic, but I hope it changes eventually because everyone can find a way to help. And no one's in healthcare for themselves, at least that's what I'd like to think. um, and when I look at fellowship to now, and I look back, I think for me, I think it's worth it. If you asked me at the end of residency, I'd have a different answer. But after fellowship and finding my niche and what makes me happy and how I can
Mhm.
impact patients the most to feel good at the end of the day, I would go back and do it again.
Wow. I appreciate you like outlining that story because without that context, it's really hard to come to that yes and be like, I would have done this. But oh man, it's like it ain't over till it's over. And it just you have no idea when it's actually over until you're
Yep.
done.
Yeah. It's hard to see the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel until you've gotten
Yeah, and even when you're there, you just take a couple days.
there.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I know your day is busy, but really appreciate you just taking your time and telling your story. It was so refreshing. Learned so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate talking with you as well. Thank you.